George, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to hear your story. You are a neuroconstructionist coach and neuroeducator. You've also led several companies, but you're also a recovering pill addict and alcoholic. And a lot of people always just notice all the good stuff and they don't see the challenges that happened along the way. So if you could just share a bit of background about what happened to you so that we can see how all of this led to doing what you're doing right now.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Hi, Natasha. Nice to be here. And hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. So I'm 64 years old. I live in Napa, California. And as you mentioned, I've been a lifelong entrepreneur, started and built a few different companies. But while that was happening, became addicted to pain pills and alcohol as a result of coping with some unwanted and unhelpful mental patterns, which had started in childhood and accompanied me into adulthood. And they caused certain, unhelpful behaviors that weren't helpful to me and those that were around me. I was easily angered, hypersensitive, hyperdefensive. And this all started in childhood with how I was brought up. And we can get into that maybe in a minute. But, so I coped that way with substances for 30 years. And in my early 50s, I hit a bottom, a really hard bottom, consuming at the time 50 pain pills a day and 2 bottles of vodka. So addiction had really grabbed a hold of me and gotten its talons into me, so to speak, and wouldn't let go. And I was a complete, victim to it. I just could no longer manage or control my usage in any way. I just had to use just to feel somewhat normal and to keep the withdrawal symptoms at bay. So that was a real moment in my life, the most important one, where I had to look in my mirror as I was sitting in rehab and wondering how the hell I had gotten there and, what was next, if anything. I just, was really in a desperate spot. And so fortunately, I, was able to summon the inner strength and the inner will to try again. I had a lot of history in my life of trying to bounce back and come back from setbacks. So that wasn't foreign to me, but this was the biggest setback, I had ever encountered and the toughest battle I would ever fight. So that started the road to recovery. I've been in recovery 12 years. And during that process, there was a lot of self-introspection, really trying to understand how I had gotten to that place, what had happened to me, how I was going to be different. Because that's really one of the biggest challenges in recovery is at the beginning is not understanding how life is going to be different. Like you've lived your life in a certain way, coping with substances for years, in my case. And that's what I knew. And those are the patterns that I had developed. And, people, in that spot just simply don't know what's next and how to get there and what it looks like. And, it's just a complete mystery. And so, I got into a 12-step program and that really helped me AA, but it really wasn't enough for me. I wanted to understand more about myself at a deeper level. So I started reading a bunch of books on spirituality, on psychology, specifically the psychology of addiction, which led me into neuroscience because addiction is a disease of the brain. And so what happens is, addiction malfunctions the brain. It causes the physiology to change. And so an addicted brain looks different and functions differently than a normal brain. The good news in all of that is that the brain is forgiving, a little bit like the liver, in that it has what's called neuroplasticity, which is the ability to change, adapt, and evolve. It can heal. and it can reorganize and rearrange itself in terms of the neurons and how they're patterned in the brain. And so what can happen is an addicted brain can reorganize, the neurons can move around to represent a new way of life, a new way of being. In order for the neurons to do that, we have to start to practice the new thinking, feeling, and behavioral patterns that represent this new life. But in response to that, the neurons will actually move. So that just became so fascinating to me, that whole process. And I was never really a big science fan in school, but it just became fascinating to me. So I just started to read more books about it. And what ended up happening is I had a career change, and I was sitting there wondering, as I'm now later in my life, what was I going to do next? And I said, this addiction story was really the most important story in my life by far. And the ability to come back from it has been so meaningful and transformative in my own life. And it's really helped make me a new and different person, one that I'm much prouder of. And it's really helped restore a lot of relationships and add so much more meaning and purpose in my life, that I thought, what a shame. I've learned so much. What a shame to keep that story to myself. Why don't I figure out how to bring it to others and see if I can help them in their changes, whether it's with addiction or any type of mental pattern that's not helpful. Because not everybody, many people have unhelpful and unwanted mental patterns and experiences, but not everybody chooses to cope with addictive substances or ends up coping with addictive substances. So neuroscience and the ability for the brain to change, adapt, and evolve helps anyone that is looking to change their mental life. And so that's really what I do now, is I help others understand what's happened to them, why they are thinking, feeling, and behaving the ways that they are, and how to change. Because that's really the moment of truth is, okay, I really don't like what's going on. I'd like to change. I have zero idea how to do it. Maybe there's a neuroscience coach out there that can help show me the light. And that's what I do.
It must have been a really difficult and lonely road, especially when you're leading all these companies. You've got to present a front to people, and behind the scenes, you've got this inner battle that's going on. How did you juggle that?
Yeah, it's very lonely. It's, the big bad secret. A lot of times, though, you think you're keeping a secret. You think you've got it under control and managed, but, the types of things that go along with addiction, the behaviors, the reactivity, these chemicals that you're taking really affect your physiology. And, you think you're hiding it, but you're not. I just used to, it affected my ability to smile. I was just so tightly wired, so activated in my nervous system as a result of these chemicals that, and I'm already a big guy and bald and all that. And so it really affects your ability, my ability to feel emotion and things of that nature. So the point of that is that, you think you're hiding it, but you're not. People notice, and if they don't tie it to addiction, they just notice that you're off, something's not right. So yeah, it's lonely because, and really at that stage of addiction, you're not using to get high anymore because the drugs have stopped working. You're just using to feel normal, or what has become normal. And normal is, I don't want to withdraw. I don't want to feel the pain that goes along with the sudden drop in neurochemicals that are keeping me somewhat normal. And so that's really what happens, is you're just using to stop the pain. That is no fun. There's no joy in that. there's no reward, there's no pleasure. It's just, trying to keep the pain at bay. So yeah, it's a lonely existence. People look at it as being selfish and, self-serving and all of that. And I guess the effect on other people appears that way, but addiction is like, being in prison. You're captive to the substance, and you're kind of just left to its instructions. You're just doing whatever it takes to get it. And so, yeah, it has no purpose, meaning. It doesn't make you feel good. It's shameful. You feel shame. You feel guilt. It's horrible.
Yeah, and I guess it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the more you take it, the more you need it, the more guilty you feel, the more you try and suppress those feelings, and it just perpetuates the cycle.
You got it. I mean, you're medicating the unhelpful mental feelings. You're medicating the physiological need to keep using. Otherwise, you're going to feel withdrawal and the pain. I mean, you're using because, your behaviors have probably not been good. Your relationships are in tatters, so you're using because of that. I mean, you're using pretty much for every reason, that exists, because your life is just in shambles, and you don't know how to get out of it. It's like you're on this hamster wheel, as I think you said, and you're just going round and round, and you don't know how to get off.
Did you find it easy to get hold of all those pills from a medical point of view? Like, is it a prescription pill?
Yeah, so I was an athlete, and I started having surgeries, in my early 40s, on different parts of my body. And that's how I got introduced to pain pills. And, I was already, in an addictive pattern. I had a couple of different episodes or runs over periods of years with cocaine and alcohol. Alcohol was prevalent kind of the whole time. And I would go, years where I would drink on the weekends and this and that. So, it took 30 years to get to the bottom. Addiction's a progressive disease, so it didn't all happen at once. But once I found pain pills and started combining them with alcohol, and yes, they started up their prescription, Vicodin, Norcos, that type of thing. I was getting them from different doctors. That was during the time where, they were a lot easier to get. And then at the end, when I was getting cut off by doctors, I found a black market source. As addicts do, we'll do anything to get what we need. But that buzz was much better than cocaine for me, just because it was soothing. It was more relaxing. It wasn't this high wired effect. But, addiction is addiction. A substance is a substance. At the end of the day, while they work slightly differently, like cocaine will work differently from meth, will work differently from alcohol. Physiological in the neurons, I mean, there's slightly different processes involved. They still have the same effect of increasing dopamine, and which is the neurotransmitter that motivates us to seek reward and pleasure. And so they all work the same way in that respect. So yeah, and then when you trade out of one drug for another, it's not like you're starting all over again with the addictive patterns, because what it is your dopamine is spiking to such a degree, and now now your neurons are beginning to malfunction. They're not processing the dopamine the way that they were. You're damaging the neurons because there's just so much dopamine that you're requiring more and more of the drug to get through the limited number of receptors in the neurons that are capable of accepting more dopamine. You're having to consume more and more, which is called tolerance. And that's what tolerance is physiologically, is your neurons are getting damaged and the dopamine can't get through. So you have to do more and more for it to get through and have anywhere near the same effect. So it really doesn't matter what drug you're using, it all just piles on top of the other one. And, there's no starting over in addiction. So even now, just as an example, 12 years later, if I were to start over again, my mind would tell me that I need to use as much as I was using when I quit to have the same effect. And that's why people overdose a lot when they start using again after long periods of abstinence, is because, they're picking up neurologically right where they left off. Like they go right back there. And so their patterns have been to use this amount of product, this amount of substance. And they also just, addicts have a certain neurological tendency where we just can't get enough. The front part of our brains, which are meant is the executive function, which is for thinking and evaluating and impulse control, that has been damaged in addiction. So it doesn't work as well. And so what's supposed to happen is that the reward part of the brain and the thinking part of the brain are supposed to talk to each other and check and balance, like different branches of government. They're supposed to check and balance each other. And the front part of the brain is supposed to tell the reward part of the brain, hey, you've been through this before, that, addictions, you have addiction and that it's not good for you and you shouldn't be doing this. But, the reward part of the brain is just, it takes over because the front part of the brain has been damaged. So, yeah, that's why so many people overdose after picking up again after years of abstinence, is because their brain takes them right back to that place where they left off, and they don't have any tolerance built up in their system anymore, and they OD because they're just taking too much substance and they can't get enough.
I know that a lot of rehab centers are renowned for not really succeeding because people will relapse and land up back again and again and again. So is it a lack? Is there something missing in the medical system that they're somehow failing?
Yes. And I don't want to get myself in trouble here, but
Yeah.
if you think about it, rehabs are a business model, and they're set up to get you well enough to go back out on the street, but they don't teach you and show you the things that you need and take you far enough down the path, typically, let me say typically, to have you be successful in recovery. In other words, it's one thing to go to rehab and get sober, but sobriety, abstinence, is much different than recovery. Recovery is, now that I'm sober, what happens next? And so what needs to happen is that you've got these patterns in your brain that are represented by these neural pathways, connections of neurons that form habits and behaviors and thinking and feeling. And the addict has lived their whole life one way. And now we're asking them to live a different way. But until they start to live that way and understand and start to have new rewards off healthy experiences, which then will build completely new neural pathways and set up a whole new mapping of their brain, until they understand how that works and start to identify a life built on these healthy experiences that will begin to give them healthy reward, not dopamine fueled reward. They just don't know where they're headed, and they don't know what that life looks like, and they don't know how to make these neurological changes. Okay. So, people are in rehab for 30 days and they get sober and they start to feel a little bit better, but they don't know what to do next. And if you don't know how to replace what you were doing with something else, and you don't know why you're doing it and how it's going to help you, you're lost. And so that's really what happens is, a lot of most of the rehabs will teach the neurology of addiction and what it is, how you need to go from there to somewhere new. And so the individual comes out of rehab and they just start living life like they were living it before, just without the substances. And that's not any good. I mean, because they were using and coping based on how their life was previously. And so if they're going to live the same way and not replace the pleasure that they were getting from the drugs with something else and figure out how to build that new life, then they're just treading water and they're not in recovery. Recovery is the endless pursuit of being a better version of yourself. So it's having a clear idea of where you're heading, what this new person looks like, what is that new person's values, their beliefs, identifying their strengths, their psychological needs, like really working with the individual to understand what is the fabric going to be of this new person that they want to be, and then building the thoughts, the feelings, the actions that will lay on top of this identity foundation and all work together and tie together seamlessly so that as they practice that new person and being that new person, the brain begins to shift and the neurons move around. They physically move around and they remap themselves. So the brain starts to look differently day by day, the more that they practice this being this new person. And that's really what the basis of recovery is about, is remapping the brain and having it look differently inside based on a new and different version of yourself that is getting reward from healthy, normal experiences again. And so, having someone understand that, where they're heading, how they're going to get there is critical to rehab or recovery being successful. And, a lot of the rehabs aren't teaching that at that level. They aren't working with the individual on the specific things that individual wants to build their life around. They aren't redesigning their identity with them. They just aren't getting at the root cause level of redesigning the individual so that they can be successful in life once they're sober.
Yeah, it sounds like if you go in there, it's great. They will take you out of the environment, but you're just going back into the environment that made you sick in the first place. So if you're going to be back with your friends, doing the same things, listening to the same music, doing the same habits. So it sounds a lot like what Joe Dispenza talks about, is making a habit of being a new you.
It's exactly right. Funny you mentioned him. I like him and the work that he does, but that's exactly right. So I liken it. Here's another analogy is think of your old self as a gnarly old oak tree that's been growing for, in my case, it was 52 years. And I've got these really gnarly roots down in the ground, right? These patterns that I've worked hard to reinforce. And they're beginning to lift up the patio because, they're starting to grow out of the ground and get really gnarly, and they're starting to cause consequences in my life. I had 3 DUIs. I hit a car with people in it. Could have hurt somebody. Fortunately, I didn't. These are real consequences that were starting to pile up. So that's kind of like the roots of the tree, and causing it to crack. Okay. And so, these patterns that are in addiction are really ingrained. And these roots are really thick. And because we've been running neurotransmitters through them as we re-engage in these addictive patterns over and over again, it's like putting fertilizer and water on these roots over and over and over again. And so habit making involves reinforcement, reenacting, repeating, repping the same actions over and over again and getting reward from it. Okay. So, the analogy is, okay, we've got this old oak tree and we're trying to get away from that oak tree. And so obviously we need to stop watering and fertilizing the oak tree, right? Because the more we do water and fertilize it, meaning acting in the same ways over and over again, taking more and more drugs, the oak tree is just going to get bigger and bigger and stronger and stronger. So if we stop watering and fertilizing it by getting abstinent, then that oak tree begins to weaken because it's not getting water and fertilizer, and it begins to go dormant, meaning those neural pathways and the strength of them beginning to weaken and go quieter. And that's what happens in abstinence, is the further you get away from the last drug or drink that you took, the less the cravings get. Okay. So meanwhile, we are going to plant a new sapling tree over on the other side of our yard. It's going to be very small at first, and it's going to have very weak roots, but we're going to take our water and fertilizing can and go over to the sapling, and we're going to start watering and fertilizing that one over and over and over and over again. And we're never going to go back to the oak tree. We're just going to let that weaken and go quieter. And we're just going to start acting like this new person through habit. And that is like watering and fertilizing this new little tree. And little by little, over time, that tree starts to get bigger and bigger. And what ends up happening is, over time and through consistent practice of this, how this new person wants to think, feel, and behave, we start to just live that life. And quietly, almost without even noticing, that old tree, that old life gets left behind. And if we're just structured and focused and intentional about our approach, we start to feel really good about this new self of ours. And we start to feel reward. We start to get this welling up of feel-good chemicals, endorphins, serotonin, even dopamine in its natural form, oxytocin from having good relationships. And, this is a new type of feeling for us. It's not these high intensity spikes of dopamine that the drugs used to give us. It's a quieter, more longer lasting, goosebump inducing sense of pride. And so we trade in the spiking of dopamine pleasure, that quick hit that spikes and goes away, and then we're looking for more. And it's just this chaotic, frenzied, just purposeless pursuit of pleasure. We trade that in for a whole new, different, it's like you take the highs and the lows out that you used to get from addiction, and now you're just living in this nice range of, you're never too low, you're never too high, you're just steady, and you just got this sense of calm and purpose and tranquility about you because you're living, acting out, thinking, feeling how this new person identifies with themselves. And a long-lasting, sustainable, more meaningful and purposeful life that, we're meant to live, right? Human beings are not meant to take drugs. Our brains were never designed to take drugs and alcohol. They're not equipped for it. They get malfunctioned by it. They just get captured by it. They get taken hostage by it. And it was never, our brains aren't designed for those things. And that's why they cause so much harm.
Yeah. I really like your analogy about the trees. It gives it a good picture.
Good. I'll keep using it then.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, because you mentioned the root cause earlier. I know that there's two sides. Like, on the one hand, you don't have to go back to your past to heal everything that ever happened to try and move forward in your life. It's not necessary. But there is somewhere, like you mentioned in the beginning, a trigger because you're blocking unwanted thoughts or emotions. So if you were, say, watering the sapling and you were in a high stress situation, and you haven't still learned to cope with that situation, would you then not go back? Is there not some form of healing that you need to do on that so that you don't get faced with it?
That is a fantastic question and really goes to the heart of recovery. So um, the thing with addicts is twofold. There's curing the addiction, or not even curing, it's abstaining from the substances and and doing that over a long period of time. But then there's also the recovering aspects of changing the underlying patterns that caused you to want to, or contributed to you wanting to drink and use in the first place. And many of us that become addicted have two things that happen to us. One is we have potentially a predisposition genetically to becoming an addict. That's why you see addiction run in families, is because our brains are wired in such a way that we have this predisposition, and things can happen in life to trigger that disposition genetically and cause it to open up and become exposure for us. And one of those things is starting to drink and use out drugs. That will trigger it. The other thing is, especially at a young age, because the front part of our brains, the thinking part, the executive control, where it has impulse control and decision making, that's supposed to put the check and balance over the reward part of our brain, that doesn't stop developing until our mid-20s. So if you start to drink and use earlier than that, that front part of your brain isn't developed enough to tell the reward part of your brain, no, don't do that. And so you're really at a handicap that way. The second thing that will cause addiction to trigger is early childhood experiences that are adverse. So trauma, any type of upbringing that is unsettling. In my case, I'll give you just a few highlights of what happened to me so that I'm sure people can relate. My dad was a career climber. I mean, he was a high producer. And so we were moving every 12 months to 18 months to a new city, which means I had to say goodbye to friends, meet new friends. It was this constant unsettledness of my development. That was very influential on me feeling less than, self-doubt, low self-esteem, constantly feeling the spotlight was on me as the new kid. My last name was Haymaker, so I used to get bullied about that. Just silly things. Also in my family, there was a lot of heavy discipline, physical discipline. So as I was becoming uncomfortable in my own skin from all this moving, I was acting out, getting angry and just self-defensive. And every time I would act out, I would get whipped by a belt. And then a few instances, even more than that. So that just simply told me I wasn't good enough the way I was. I was already struggling, and here I was getting punished for struggling. There was some sexual abuse that happened to me from older boys in one of my neighborhoods. And then lastly, my parents moved overseas when I was in ninth grade, and I went away to boarding school here in the United States. So I was fending for myself. I got to see my family once a year. So, that's not, people have had quote unquote much worse upbringings than that, but it was enough for me to feel really unsettled. And so what happens when you have those experiences is, and you have addiction in your genes, that those traumas will trigger the genes to express themselves, and you become much more likely to become an addict. So when you add childhood trauma or adverse childhood experiences on top of genetic predisposition to addiction in your genes, you are 10 to 12 times more likely to become an addict than someone that doesn't have those things. So, what happens is children have these patterns in their brains that happen from these early experiences. And that's really what our brains are, is just a mapping of all of our experiences that we've ever had in life. And so if they're negative experiences, then that's how our brain is wired and mapped out. And so, we carry these with us into adulthood, and they're not comfortable. They're filled with self-doubt, anger, reactivity emotionally, you name it. They're not the anxiety, depression. They're not comfortable. We don't like them. We want to get rid of them. And somebody gives us a drink or a drug, and oh my God, it gets better. And so then we use and drink to cope. And so then when you stop using and drinking and in recovery, you're still left with those uncomfortable patterns. And so, life's not going to get better until they get rewired. And that is exactly what happens. And what I do as a neuroscience coach is that you have to revisit those experiences, and you have to come to terms with them, and you have to deconstruct, and that's what I did, is I went back to those early childhood experiences, and I was able to look at them with help and say, okay, here's why I was getting angry all those years. Here's why I was feeling uncomfortable. And it began to make sense to me. And then I realized that it really wasn't me. It was what happened to me. And so being able to rationalize and construct in that way, and then say, I don't want to feel this way anymore. So I'm going to look at those experiences differently. Instead of feeling like I was less than, I'm going to say, well, these things happened to me. I no longer want them to run my life. I want to be this way instead of that way. So I'm gonna take all that I've just learned about examining myself and these experiences, and I'm gonna package them up in a book and call it a chapter in my life. And I'm gonna put it on a bookshelf, and I'm gonna move on from it. And I'm gonna forgive those that harm me, and I'm gonna make amends to those that I've harmed. And I'm gonna get all the weight of that guilt and shame off my shoulders, so that I can be free from those uncomfortable mental experiences, guilt, shame, less than, self-doubt, low self-esteem, not good enough, you name it. I got to get all of that off my shoulders so that I can be clean and free to begin to rebuild a new version of myself. So to your point, you don't have to necessarily release. There's different words for all of this, but really what it is you're trying to unburden yourself. You're trying to get the weight of these experiences off your shoulders so that you can be clean and move forward with a new slate and allow these patterns to loosen up, because that's what's happened. These old negative patterns are wired like these gnarly roots in the oak tree. And by looking back at them and rationalizing and reconstructing them and working with them, you're loosening the glue and the grip that make these roots so strong. And so once they begin to relax and loosen, and you stop watering and fertilizing them because you're not engaging in them anymore, they begin to quiet down, and then you begin to build the new ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving that represent the new sapling.
You say it's not a lot for a child to go through, but I think that's an awful lot to go through. And I'm sure a lot of our viewers will have experienced similar feelings of being punished for suffering already, because our parents weren't given the tools. I mean, they probably went through it as well. We were taught growing up to just be quiet. Children are meant to be seen and not heard. Let them cry it out. Beat it out of them. They used to say, if you don't stop crying, I'll give you something to cry about. And that was the way we were brought up. Dr. Spock came along and said, babies should cry. It's good for them. So yeah, and I really like the fact that you've seen how it helps for people to rise above that situation, because you're not the sum of your experiences in this life. You're the sum of everything, not just that.
Yeah. And if you don't like the experiences you've had, again, we are what we are today. based on the accumulation of all our past experiences. And those experiences have now wired themselves into your brain. What's wonderful is that we all get a second chance and a third and a fourth if we need it, because the brain is forgiving and it will reorganize itself. You don't have to stay in those experiences. The brain will work with you and come along with you and reorganize and repattern itself if you choose to start having new experiences. But the brain doesn't reorganize until you start to practice these new experiences that are more helpful, that represent this new person that you want to be. Okay, it's the chicken or the egg. The new experiences is what cause the brain to rewire itself. So, every time, and doesn't happen overnight, and it's a process, and it takes 90 days to begin to. You start to see benefit even sooner when you're working with a coach like me. But after 90 days, you begin to really get it, and you are well down the path of transformation. Your brain is well in the process of rewiring itself. You're starting to experience all new things. But what can happen is that these old patterns, a stressful event will occur. An old way of thinking will pop up because, hey, it's been there for however many years, right? And that's the way our current mental life works, is that our brain goes and searches for old experiences that were like what we're experiencing now. So if you have a stressor, a trigger that causes an old experience to come forward, and you begin to relive it in the way that you always did, that's where we need to catch ourselves and say, hold on. I see this old pattern arising again. I refuse to allow myself to water and fertilize that by re-engaging in it over and over again. Because if you go through the whole process of feeling the same way you used to, thinking the same way you used to, acting the same way you used to, you are running water and fertilizer through that old pathway. And so we have to catch ourselves, stop ourselves in the moment, breathe, downregulate ourselves, and remember that this is not who I want to be anymore. This is how I want to think about and feel about and act with this experience, not that old way. And when you do that, you now reinforce the new pathway, and it allows the new pathways to strengthen themselves and become more habitual. And before people need to think of this as working with their minds and their brains, like learning a new instrument, like learning to ride a bike, like learning a new language, like learning how to play a sport. All of those things are also functions of the brain, but they also took a lot of practice. So this is just like that. It's like learning a new language, where you are teaching your brain how to act, think, and feel different. It's no different than any of those other things. So if you look at it that way and remember how long it took you to learn some other thing new, and how it was uncomfortable at the beginning, and you didn't know how, and it was hard, and you kept screwing up, and you couldn't remember, this word or that word, in a foreign language, but you stayed with it and you kept practicing. And before you knew it, it got better. That's the same exact way as it is with, redeveloping your mental patterns.
I think people are not aware that they need to train their brains. They think, this is how I am, this is who I've always been. There's that saying, you can't teach a dog new tricks. And I agree with you. But I also think there's a point that comes in somebody's life where they realize they need to make a change. Like, it's got to come from inside, because you could go send someone to rehab, but if they're not really interested in changing, they're going because their wife told them to go or whatever, then they're not going to. What was it for you that made you actually change your trajectory? What was your rock bottom?
Well, I'll tell you what did it for me. And then I'll tell you about why the brain doesn't want to change, or why it's hard for the brain to change.
Yeah.
So I just simply could not go on any longer. I mean, at the end, I tried to kill myself, or, you know, let's just say I had a knife in my hands, and my cousin had killed himself in a drug situation by slitting his wrists and laying in a warm bath. So I was trying to reenact that. I'd scared my wife off and my dogs, and I didn't go through with it. I ended up getting into rehab. So my catalyst was life was really bad, and I just simply did not want to experience that anymore. And it was so bad that I would do anything to change it. So in my case, it really wasn't because I didn't know what was next. It wasn't the reward of what might be better. It was trying to avoid and not go back to what I knew was freaking horrible. I mean, the pain that you're in withdrawal for the first 7 days in rehab when you're taking what I was taking is brutal. I mean, you walk around like a zombie. So that's what it was for me. But, it took a lot of, I went to 3 different rehabs before it finally stuck. And I won't get into all that, but it just was this process of finally hitting what I determined to be my bottom. And so you're right. No one is going to make anyone else change. It has to come from within. Now, the brain needs reward in order for it to pursue anything new. It needs to identify that there's something different that's going to be more rewarding than what it's experiencing right now. Because the brain's number one job is to keep us safe and alive. If you think about like when we were created, way back when, there weren't smartphones and cool cars and everything else that were rewarding. There was just, cavemen, and we were given reward over a few basic things. Having sex felt great, so that we could have babies and continue with the species, because that's really the brain's objective, is to have the species survive and evolve and continue. We were giving reward for eating food. Food has to taste good, otherwise we wouldn't get it. If we didn't get it, we wouldn't survive, because we need food to survive. Water, the same thing. And social interactions, the same thing. We feel good interacting with people because early on, we needed to band together in tribes and cavemen groups in order to help defend off the dinosaurs. Otherwise, if we were all alone and didn't get pleasure from congregating together, we would get picked off one by the dinosaurs, and our species wouldn't have survived. And so our brains are wired to have these real basic needs and instincts. The main one is to make sure that we survive and continue on as a species. So the brain is constantly looking around, for threats. It's constantly, it just wants to keep our body systems running. So that's really the basis of the brain. So the brain needs reward in order to pursue anything. It's kind of like a dog needs a treat in order to learn a new habit. Our midbrains, the reward part of our brains, are very similar to that. And so my reward, as I identified it, was trying to avoid the misery that had taken place. That was enough to get me to change. But then little by little, that needs to be supplanted and supplemented by additional rewards. It's not enough to just avoid misery. We really want to, as human beings, pursue something better. And so that's what happened, is I began to build a life that had a bunch of different things in it that I identified as rewarding to me. And so, and then I just created this life around trying to be constantly better and better, a better version of myself, healthier, more productive, pursuing things that I enjoyed, helping others, eating well, exercising, being fit. I outlined a bunch of different things that I liked that made me feel good. And so then the brain wants to it identifies that, okay, that sounds good. It seems to feel good to us. So let's go do more of that. And so that's really what this process is figuring out what's rewarding enough, maybe trying to avoid misery when you're in this addictive state, to get you to stop. And then very quickly, we need to start identifying a life that is going to be rewarding for this individual so that their brain says, okay, that sounds good. And then you begin to experience it little by little. The brain realizes it's safe. It's not going to kill us. It's rewarding. So it starts to come with you and be more willing participant in wanting to pursue this life. And it's very hard at the beginning, like learning a new language, learning a new instrument, because the brain's uncertain about it. It doesn't know if it's rewarding. But then, just like as you learn any other activity, it starts to feel more rewarding over time because you're better at it and you feel more accomplished at it. You start to get the neurochemicals that are represent have and this and that. And so the brain starts to really gravitate towards it when it starts to become rewarding. And then that's also part of why the brain leaves the addiction behind, is because it starts to get its reward starts to get satisfied by this new life, and it recognizes that it's better for us than that old life. And so then it doesn't really even want to go back and start pulling those experiences anymore. Like they start to occur less and less because they're just not, the brain's getting everything it needs over here with this new life.
It's the same like hamster wheel, but in a positive aspect. So it's now positive reinforcement instead of negative reinforcement. And also like moving towards pleasure instead of running away from pain. And not pleasure in the sense of a quick fix, pleasure in the sense of a fulfilling life, not an empty, like having a drink that's not going to give you the calories you need. It's just instant gratification, but not long-term satisfaction.
Yeah, I prefer to trade out the words pleasure for well-being. Because pleasure to me still represents, immediate gratification.
Yeah. Pleasure would be the wrong word, but moving towards something that's more life, well, like you said, well-being. Yeah.
Things like, well-being related. So it's that encompasses a lot of things. It's fulfillment. There is pleasure in that. We still need dopamine and pleasure in order to want to be motivated to pursue well-being. So they are interrelated, but I just, it's just for me, that word pleasure just has some connotations in it that, represent my old way of being. And so I just really try to, and that may be parsing words to the listener, but I will tell you that if the word pleasure for me brings me back to the big oak tree in any way and cause me to relate to it and fertilize and water it in any way, then I don't want any part of it. And so it's good for me and anyone to disassociate themselves from anything that had anything to do with that old way of life. And so words are important. They're meaningful. We wouldn't be using them if they weren't meaningful. And so, I choose my words carefully, and, everyone should, and use the words that represent this new identity, this new way of being that the individual has laid out for themselves. And so, these are important, concepts.
Absolutely. That really makes sense. And I'm glad you pointed that out, because you're right. What might mean pleasure to me is one thing versus what it means to another. But I'm going to assume not everyone has to hit rock bottom the way you did. What could they do if they wanted to change their life without having to go down that road as far as you did?
Yeah. Make a decision that enough is enough. And I think the knowledge, like the knowledge of neuroscience, that how we are is just a culmination of all of our past experiences, and they're represented by patterns in the brain. and that these patterns can be changed. Just having that knowledge that that's what, because a lot of times, like, we're in this body, our mind is doing things, and we don't have a relationship with our mind or our brain. We don't know how it's constructed. And so we don't know that it's there to help us and work for us. We just think that it's there and we have to take what it gives us. So another analogy for you is an average person will think of their brain like they're sitting in the passenger seat of the car, and they don't know where they're going and they don't have any control over it. And their brain is driving the car, and wherever the brain takes us, it takes us. What I'm referring to is the recognition that actually we do have control over our brain. We do have control over where the car is going. The brain, we can get up, we can ask the brain to stop the car. We can get out of the passenger seat, go around to the driver's seat, hop in, tell the brain to get over to the passenger seat, and we're driving now. And so, we have that ability, the physiological capability to change at any time. It doesn't have to get bad. And first of all, time's ticking. Instead of you could change now and have more years of living the way you want to live, having the mental life you want to have, or you could wait 5 years and go 5 years further down the road, strengthening those old patterns even more, wasting 5 years that you could have been living a different life. And oh, by the way, the consequences probably were piling up while you were living the old way. Things like your health got worse because, these mental patterns aren't healthy. Stress is not healthy. It has all kinds of biological, psychological impacts on our health. It leads to, it's a contributor to inflammation, which leads to disease, specifically cognitive diseases. That's still being understood as to what the root causes of Alzheimer's and dementia are, but stress certainly doesn't help. And so, it's up to you to decide, but I think the knowledge of knowing that change is there for us and it can happen, and here's how, is a really important, tool, and comfort to people, knowing that it's there for us to, take advantage of.
Yeah. Well, I think it's making that decision and then sticking with it. And I know for me, especially, I used to get very dysregulated emotionally. And then the brain actually takes a back seat. The body takes over and all those old habits come back. But if you're able to catch yourself in that moment and say, this is just passing, this is not who I am, it's a glitch, it's just a patch. And get yourself out of that situation and just ride that space and distance instead of buying into it. Then you're able to not feel like you've failed yourself in some way, acted out in a way that you shouldn't have, because that's, again, when you create those self-fulfilling patterns again.
Exactly. Yeah. When you engage in it, like you say, you're just fertilizing and watering the same pattern over and again. And so if you can stop it, just observe it, and then begin to think to yourself, how would I have preferred this to go? What alternative thoughts, feelings, and actions would I have preferred to have happen here? And then just visually go through that and then begin to act out what that looks like. You begin to set the stage for a new neural pathway that represents how you could act and feel and think in that situation, which then starts the transformation process. Has to start somewhere, right? And so why not right here, right now? And that's as simple as it is that you are just gonna, if you were doing something else wrong, like let's say you had the wrong technique at something, and you want to change it to the right technique to get better at it, like maybe a golf swing or something else, it takes practice. And so would you wait to change your golf swing if you wanted to play better? No, you'd start to work on it. So that's what we're talking about here. It's no more complicated than that, but you have to stop practicing the old way and start practicing the new way in order for it to begin to take hold.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the hardest part is actually sticking with it in the short term. As you get better at it, becomes easier. I think people, they want the instant results that they get from getting that hit. So if they say, oh, well, I've made the change, but I'm feeling bad again tomorrow. I'm feeling bad again the next day. It's not working. They need to ride that through. And also getting support, like you said earlier, because the people that know you are not going to be able to help you because they haven't in the past. Why would they now? And they wouldn't know what to do. They're not coaches. They're not psychologists. They're just struggling along doing their thing. So on that note, George, where can people get hold of you?
Yeah, my website is georgehaymaker.com, GeorgeHaymaker.com. And there's a link on there to schedule a free discovery call for 30 minutes where we can talk about your situation and what's going on with you and see if we're a good fit to work together.
Awesome. I'll post those links below. And do you have a message for our viewers before we go?
Yeah, just hope and encouragement. Hopefully that, today's talk has illuminated you in some way. Most importantly, that, your thoughts and feelings and actions are not you. They are the patterns that you've developed over time, and they're now ingrained in your brain. But those patterns can easily change if you start thinking, feeling, and acting different. So the experience of your future don't have to be the experiences of your past. And the brain is there to work with you, be your partner, to transform. It's not something that is just there that you're stuck with. It's something that is actually shapeable, evolvable, adaptable, formable. So the science is there that supports everything that I'm saying. It's just a matter of, and if you think deep about it, you know that because you've taught your brain new things all the time. We're never too old to stop learning. So if you've learned something else new in the past, then you have evidence right there that you can learn something else new in the future. And that includes your mental, your mental activity.
Thank you for that. And I think anybody who's still listening now is interested in wanting to do that, make that change. Or they wouldn't have stayed this long. So thank you for that. And and thank you for sharing your story because I think it's incredibly important. A lot of people think it's not easy. You weren't in the situation. You don't understand what I've been going through. But hearing it from someone who's actually been through it themselves and lived to tell the tale, it's encouraging. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that story. George, it was a pleasure meeting you. People are really needing some real help. Somehow I feel like the medical system has failed us. And it's time for people to take ownership and responsibility for their own health and happiness and well-being, as you say.
Yep, got to advocate for yourself. Thank you so much. Okay, take care.